Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the annual Yale Philanthropy Conference and our session, which is called America's Damaging Criminal Legal System, Reimagining the System at Every Level. My name is Diane Serapina. I'm the Director of Justice Initiatives at the Tao Foundation, a family foundation based in Connecticut. And I'm going to be joined shortly by my esteemed colleagues. I consider the three of us system reformers and advocates, envisioning and reimagining a criminal legal system that is less harmful and terrorizing and punitive, and one that's more restorative. So you will be hearing something about the history of our system, what it looks like today, where the opportunities are, what are our solutions, what the experience of people who've lived through the system have been and continue to be. Hopefully will spark you to think about the definition of public safety, punishment, how long punishments should last, what corrections really means, a lot of these questions that keep coming up for a lot of us who have been in this space for a very long time. I'll give you a little bit of the logistics before we get into our discussion. All of your lines are muted right now, but we welcome you to add your questions to the chat. We will have 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the session to take some of these questions. And there's also an opportunity for a 30-minute unstructured time at the end of this program for you to talk with colleagues on participating. So I'm looking at the numbers, and it looks like we're approaching almost 400 people on this session, and that's very exciting. We've been told that we have students, academics, funders, providers, system providers, advocates, policymakers. So I'm sure many of you are experts on the criminal legal system. Others know nothing about it. And then there's everything in between. So, but I'm sure you all know that our criminal legal system has been around for 500 years since the founding of our country. It's been based on structural racism and punishment. And so many funders, I'll just speak from the funder side, have been aware of these issues for decades. Unfortunately, it took a while for funders to really get into this space. And we're now seeing another transformation of the advocacy and the organizing around system reform and the critical need for it. So I'm really excited about the conversation today. So I'm going to start by just describing our work at the Tao Foundation. We're a family foundation that was founded in 1988 by an entrepreneur, Leonard Tao, and his wife, Claire. And from the beginning, they were very interested in what was then called disadvantaged children and families. We were funding in a geographic area of Westchester County, New York, and Fairfield County in Connecticut, two affluent counties, obviously, with very inequitable systems and policies that was damaging to children and families, especially Black and Brown communities in our urban areas. And in the course of investing in these kinds of services for children, we discovered a population in Connecticut, a small program in Bridgeport, the largest city in Connecticut, that was working with children on parole. And we discovered, to our horror at the time, that Connecticut and New York were two of the three states nationally that treated young people who got involved with the law as adults at the age of 16, and that we incarcerated in the adult system more children under the age of 18 than most other states. And this sparked our interest in exploring our justice system for youth in Connecticut, and inspired us to join with three other advocacy organizations to found the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance, a coalition of leaders from advocacy groups, legal services, provider networks, even child advocate and public defender communities. So this coalition was so important to us and still exists today and has been instrumental in making Connecticut a leader in youth justice reform. We have raised that age of adultification to 18. We sparked interest among at least 10 other states to raise their age. There are only 3 states now nationally, Georgia, Texas, and Wisconsin, that still haven't raised their age from 17 to 18, and there's pressure on them to do that. We were instrumental in getting the state of Connecticut to close its only youth prison, and we're seeing that happening in lots of states across the country. So there has been tremendous growth in shrinking the youth system, and what we are doing now as a foundation is working with colleagues across the country interested in criminal justice reform on the adult side and using the shrinking of the youth system as a decarceration strategy, that if we can eliminate the use of a justice system for young people under 18, and in many states there's a movement to raise that age to 21 or higher based on the brain development research that has been going on for the last 20 years, that we hope that we'll see fewer people in the adult system. And I was able to collect some data from our Connecticut folks, and I want to say that our prison population has dropped 55% since 2008. Young adults 18 to 21 are down 76%. 6 adult prisons have closed, including an announcement this week that our Supermax, the most punitive facility, will close, in addition to 2 more later this year. The only juvenile prison was closed, and the only population that's going up, and I hope we'll touch upon it during our Q&A and our conversation with the other speakers, is the population over age 60, because these are people who've had the longest sentences and probably were accused of the most violent crimes. So we have to consider what is violence and how long should people be punished for that violence. So we've been in the criminal system for about 8 years now, starting with college and prison, theater and prison, trying to ban solitary confinement, deal with other issues in the conditions in prison, and also to support people in their reentry home, and the removal of the barriers to employment, education, housing, and healthcare, and other things that a criminal record brings to people. So we've been really pleased with the success. We know that there's so much more to do. I've seen the transition of funders funding only direct service to moving into supporting advocacy as a strategy, to then investing in organizers and people of color-led organizations. And now, as Dominique, one of our speakers, will touch upon, the abolition movement. And so there are many funders, small and large, who are really focused and interested in learning more and doing better, and not using our white privilege to the degree that it has been in the past used by philanthropy. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We'll start with Dominique Morgan, who's the executive director of Black and Pink, which is a national organization based in Omaha, Nebraska, and it's focused on prison abolition and the support of system-impacted LGBTQ, transgender, and HIV-positive individuals. Dominique will share Black and Pink's mission, which is to build leaders from among these impacted people and helping them to envision and drive their own success by providing physical, mental, and emotional safety that they need to do this. And our other speaker is Lauren-Brooke Eisen, known as LB. LB is the director of the Justice Program at the Brennan Center for Justice in New York City, and she leads Brennan's work to end mass incarceration and build consensus around solutions that enhance safety and justice for all populations. LB is widely published as an author of reports and articles on a range of justice issues, including private prisons, prosecutorial practices, sentencing, and corrections. And in her previous roles, she was a senior program associate at the Vera Institute of Justice and was an assistant district attorney in New York City. So I'm going to mute myself and let Dominique introduce herself and her organization.
Thank you, Diane. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dominique Morgan. I am the executive director of Black and Pink National. At Black and Pink, so many people get caught up on the word abolition, and I get the responses to, well, what do we do without prison or jails? What do we do without policing? And my answer is that I don't know, but I do know that these systems currently are not working for our people. As someone who, in a room of data and narrative people, I'm always going to lean into the narrative. I think it's always interesting that the data folks can never tell me how our systems are enacting transformation. If these systems work, conversations about recidivism, Diane having to fund address these issues would not be the case. They would have it worked out by now. Hundreds of years of incarcerating people, of policing people, of harming Black and brown bodies. In 2021, if it worked, I believe they would understand what that equation looks like. But it's not the case. At Black and Pink, we want to dismantle these systems, not just because we want to live, some people's like, y'all want to live willy-nilly. Well, we want freedom and liberation. We want a person to be able to envision what their best self looks like and really believe they can touch it and have community that supports them in accessing that. And so we focus at the intersection of LGBTQ plus individuals and people who identify as living with HIV and AIDS. But our ultimate desire, our hard work, our values are based in making sure that everyone has access. I personally identify woman who is formerly incarcerated myself for nearly a decade in the adult system, in the youth system from the age of 13 to 17. In that time, 18 months in solitary confinement, 6 months of that living on death row in Nebraska's prison system. On Monday, it will be a 12-year anniversary from the day I was released from prison. And my access and my privilege to education, to individuals who believed in my work, has positioned me to be able to engage in the cultural approach and thought leadership and implementation of programming across the country. But I really am an intercessor for folks who will never have that opportunity due to systems of oppression, due to white supremacy, due to just our inherent biases. So I hope today that as we talk about humanizing folks who are system impacted, I'm not approaching this from a standpoint that I want you to be nicer to people who have been system impacted. What I want you to do is understand that whether you know it or not, the harm that's impacted to folks that you are connected to in community, and whether you believe that or not, incarcerated folks are in your community, will affect you down the line. And so we have to have a community approach that says, although it has not affected me directly, it still matters. I will invest in it. And I will simply invest in it because this person is just like me in more ways than not. And so Diane and everyone at the conference, thank you so much for having me back. Last year I was snowed in Nebraska trying to get here. And the J.M. Kaplan Foundation, for one, choosing me as a fellow, but two, Justin and that team for just supporting me being back here on the platform. So thank y'all.
LB?
Everyone, my name is LB Eisen, and as Diane noted, I direct the Justice Program here at the Brennan Center for Justice. We are an organization that is affiliated with the New York University Law School, and the program that I lead focuses on how we can, as a country, end our reliance on corrections, and our reliance on the carceral system as we know it. You just heard from Dominique at how devastating our jails and our prisons are to not only the people who are inside our jails and prisons as we're having this virtual event today, but the family members of all of those people, community members associated with those individuals. And so a lot of the work that we do really focuses on educating the broader community on how mass incarceration has really been a moral failure in this country. And oftentimes, for those of you, I can't see all of the audience members, but for those of you, who are listening today, we often say our criminal justice system is broken. And many people in the field, we're using the term criminal legal system, right? And that's because, more practitioners, more advocates are really sort of drilling home this idea that there's nothing just about our criminal justice system. And so I think language matters when we do talk about mass incarceration, when we do talk about our carceral state. because I, for one, don't think there is much that is just about our criminal legal systems as they exist today. And I just wanted to, give a few statistics. Many of you are aware of these, but I think it's worth repeating today just to understand the vast size and scope of our criminal legal system, this carceral state, and how much work we all have to do to really shrink the size and scope of mass incarceration in the United States. So most of you probably know this statistic that the United States holds fewer than 5% of the world's people, but almost 20% of the world's prison population. There are about 2.2 million people behind bars, more than 9 million admissions in and out of our county and city jails every year. Some of those, it's not 9 million people, it's admissions, but it gives you, I think, a sort of a lens into just how cyclical this system is. There are 4.5 million people on probation and parole, and that's double the number of people who are incarcerated. So when we talk about this carceral state, 7 million people who are under some sort of, parole supervision, probation supervision in our jails, in our prisons. There are more than 70 million people in the United States who have a conviction history. And those conviction histories subject people to lifelong consequences. In some states, as many of you are very aware, you can't vote because of a criminal conviction. And so, the collateral consequences are in the, 20, 25,000, for those people who have actually cataloged these. There are collateral consequences in every conceivable part of life once someone is released from jail or prison, or even, just has a conviction history. Mass incarceration is truly a failed policy. It's not necessary to keep down crime, as a lot of the research that we've done at the Brennan Center has proven, and it destroys the lives of those individuals and their families. And the Brennan Center came out with research a few years ago where we found that about 40% of people in our prison system absolutely don't need to be there for, any public safety rationale. And that's just scratching the surface. We know our prisons are places filled with trauma where people are being re-traumatized. We know that we are not giving people any sort of programming. There are wait lists in almost every state federal prison in this country for programming, as Dominique can tell you. And so, we at the Brennan Center, we're a small team, but a lot of the work that we do is to try to sort of educate the broader public as to how we can start to dismantle mass incarceration and really try to shrink the carceral state as we know it. We have far too many people in our jails and our prisons, and the people who are there are serving sentences that are far too long. We often talk about this phrase, punitive excess. And I think that's just a really fitting phrase for, what's happening in the United States, that our first response to so many perceived social harms is incarceration and a law enforcement response. And we as a country have so much work to do to educate our policymakers and the broader public as to the moral and public failures of mass incarceration.
So Dominique, I was wondering if you could touch upon the realities of how the criminal legal system impacts individuals and various populations. And it's, this past year, it's been a heavy year with the COVID pandemic and the impact on the incarcerated population and their families, the racial unrest, the police brutality, the white supremacy. We've just been witnessing some horrendous policies that maybe people were unaware of, and maybe you could just touch upon how things may feel different right now for the people you're helping.
Well, I think the sad truth is that it's this resounding statement that we're making to system impacted people that they will always be othered. And I need to say that most system impacted people were othered before incarceration intersected in their lives. But this idea that, serve your time and be done, or, we don't need to worry about those folks because the prisons are taking care of them, or our taxes are taking care of them, so on and so forth. It's the truth that once you are touched by this system, your lived experience will be forever changed. Like, that is the truth. And when we looked at 2020, when we look at the impact of COVID-19, it was interesting to talk to funders because they would ask this question, like, how has your work changed due to COVID? And now in 2021, they're asking how has your work changed since COVID? Well, I didn't know we were since COVID. I didn't know that was like a thing that we're experiencing yet. And what we're seeing is that system impacted people are still navigating the impact of summer of 2020, of the fall of 2020, of winter of 2020, right? If you have the mainstream population that are struggling to stay employed, that can't access support services, that are getting evicted, what do you think's happening to those who are being released from prison during the pandemic? That would have had to struggle to be able to work at a Burger King or a restaurant in our normal times. And these places now are not a safe haven for someone who's formerly incarcerated or someone who doesn't have a wealth of received work experience by our community. When we look at LGBTQ plus people and folks living with HIV and AIDS, right, you add this additional layer that much more difficult. As a Black trans woman who is employed, who has access, all the things down the list, there are still barriers to me being able to buy the house or live in the home that I want to. 12 years later. So when I look at folks who are just out of prison and people are perceiving because they're trans that they're more impacted by COVID, or people who are not being released from prison because the prison won't give them the vaccine and the community doesn't want them released into their community without being vaccinated. You vaccinated all of the COs, all of the administration staff, all of the incarcerated people who have been impacted by COVID. You've cut off visitation. So they've only acquired COVID through your staff and your team. Why are we not vaccinating our incarcerated population at a high level? Why are people with HIV and AIDS writing Black and Pink every day saying, I'm afraid I'm going to die and no one's going to care? I think, and just to wrap it up, I think that whatever casual approach that our community had towards the impact of incarceration is that much more exacerbated because those of us in the mainstream feel like we were deeply impacted. And we're like, I can't focus on you because I need to focus on me. I'm not going to focus on you because you made the choice. Yeah, it may be hard. Oh my God, I would hate to live like that. But you made choices. And I think that is a terrible approach to community. And the last thing I'll say is that there are so many people who made tweets and Facebook posts that when the quarantines were happening, oh my God, this feels like prison, including Ellen DeGeneres. And I wrote an op-ed about it. And although I disagree and I find that statement tacky and tasteless, I will, if that is your true belief, take that opportunity to engage in some empathy and multiply that by 100. Understand that right now, most of us are positioned to either I've had the first dose of the vaccine or folks know when they're going to be on the list. And incarcerated people are not a part of that conversation. Understand the power to decide who you're around or how you quarantine was yours. Whether you liked it or not, you had choice. Think about if you did not have choice. So I believe it just made us care less and feel valid about caring less because we were more impacted. And I don't think that I have to give up my humanity and my grace and my desire for my community to thrive in order for me to have that same desire for myself.
Thank you so much. LB, do you have anything to add to how the current state of affairs is impacting your research and recommendations for reform?
I mean, to Dominique's point about COVID and the way that we're treating people in our prisons and our jails, we've tried to do a lot of advocacy here at the Brennan Center. We wrote a letter to Governor Cuomo We wrote a letter to all 50 state governors, sent it to all directors of corrections. We didn't see much result from these letters, unfortunately, but we're trying to do what we can to let the broader public know what it is like in these jails and these prisons. And everything that Dominique just said is so important, right? You can't social distance in these places. You can't choose to use Purell, every 30 seconds. I mean, these are congregate settings. And so we've been urging governors and directors of corrections to use their executive authority, whether it's through clemency, the pardon process, whether it's through just releasing people early, 3 months, 6 months early, who are near the end of their sentence, letting people who are, vulnerable, older individuals, people with underlying health problems, be released from these congregate settings. So it's something that we're continuing to push for. There have been a few states, Rhode Island is prioritizing vaccinating incarcerated individuals. My understanding is that New Jersey is going to start, if they haven't already, vaccinating incarcerated individuals. But so few states are prioritizing those incarcerated people in congregate settings. So for those of you who are listening, who are in different states, different counties, who have access to these governors, directors of corrections, I'd really implore you to do what you can to lend your voice to this advocacy, because it's really important. And people are cycling in and out of these places, family members. And so when we think about the public health crisis, it's really, really important that we don't forget about people who are in our prisons and our jails. And so, agree with everything Dominique just said.
I wrote this in the chat, but I just wanted to say that thank you so much for that, LB. But I want to uplift also that these wardens and these systems did not listen, but I want to amplify the power when incarcerated people know that someone outside cares. So although policies may have not changed, we did not see the mass of the elderly, the immunocompromised folks that we wanted to see immediately released, regardless of what organizations like myself or Miss Susan Burton with the New Way of Life, we had space available for these folks to come to. We saw so many people say, you know what, at least I know someone cares. And as someone who was incarcerated, I think one of the ways that I saw my humanity start to dissipate is that I believed no one cared about me. And so those are those moments that was an initiative around policy, but I also consider that to be a solidarity effort. And I just want to uplift that, because there's so many folks who are like, I'm not going to take it to the streets. I'm not going to pick it. I'm not that person that is going to do activism in the way that we portray activism to be. But all approaches to the work are valid when it centers the health, the life, joy of incarcerated people. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And I wanted to pull that out for folks who may not see the spectrum of advocacy as something that impacts them, that there's something everyone can do that will center incarcerated people.
So the idea that COVID forced a lot of policymakers and advocates to pivot over the last year and trying to get more people out of jails and prisons brings me to the thought of how the system is shrinking. There are states like Connecticut that are closing facilities, and yet in the same breath, the governor says the funding will be put into reduce the deficit of the state rather than reinvesting in communities and providing the reentry support that people need when they're released from prison, because we're setting people up for failure when we don't address their health needs, their housing needs, their employment needs, and so forth. So I'm wondering if both of you could address how we can advocate, the 500 plus people we have on this call and others, with policymakers, with the media, with everybody regarding justice reinvestment, which has been around for 20 years, but no one has been doing it well. And we haven't sustained the reentry providers and the safety net in the community. So I don't know who wants to take that first. LB?
And so actually when I worked at the Institute, I was grant funded by the Justice Reinvestment Grant, actually, which at the time was a federal grant that was, the Vera Institute had this grant, as did, some other organizations to work in counties and in states to essentially work with states to reduce their prison populations and sort of stop the at the time there were so many states that were looking at their prison populations, their prison trajectories over the next 2 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and the states couldn't handle from a budgetary perspective, from a facility perspective, these increases. So the idea was with justice reinvestment that states would look at their statutes, would look at corrections, would look at probation, would look at how to stop sending so many people to jails and prisons, and how to stop the flow of, a lot of you are probably aware, but it gets about 40% of people in prison are there because of a technical violation of probation, right? Which is not committing a new crime, but it could be something like not showing up for drug programming or court dates, violating a condition of probation. And so a lot of the emphasis on that grant was, working with states so that they weren't sending people back to prisons for these violations. But, as Diane noted, one of the, I would say, a big criticism of this work was states were not reinvesting in communities that we as a country have never invested in. And what was happening was, the money would go back to the probation department to figure out how to implement intermediate sanctions, as opposed to going back to communities that sorely needed this money for schools, for education. And so I'm hopeful, I don't have any intel, but I would be hopeful that as this federal administration, we have a new president, the Biden-Harris administration, if they are looking at these grant programs, I really hope that they're going to be very thoughtful about this work and not just, sending money to states to sort of tweak little, aspects of corrections and sentencing policy here and there, but really thinking thoughtfully about what communities need the money. And, even at the Brennan Center, we have come up with a policy proposal that has been introduced in Congress by Senators Booker and Blumenthal and Representative Cardenas, called the Reverse Mass Incarceration Act. And that policy proposal, we've sort of framed it as the antidote to the truth in sentencing provision of the 94 crime bill. That funding provision actually paid states if they created longer sentences for people convicted of violent crimes, required people stay behind bars for 85% of their sentences. So this new policy proposal would actually fund states to reduce incarceration and crime. And so states would be paid if they can start decarceration. So we're planning on working with Congress and the administration on hopefully introducing and maybe passing this legislation, because we think it's time that states really focused on decarceration and investing in communities.
Dominique, can you address that, justice reinvestment? What can funders do in terms of supporting the safety net, that's necessary in the community?
Well, the first thing I will say is those of us who are depending on funders to continue to engage with us in radical and transformative ways, do not backtrack from how open and how malleable funders were in 2020. You saw funders, Black and Pink had grants, and funders came back and said, hey, we have an extra $10,000 for your needs. Or, hey, you didn't apply for this, but we're sending you this. Or you did apply, there's no reporting process. So the reporting process is for us to have a conversation, or the barriers were taken down. I will say that because of the access and privilege Black and Pink has, right? I'm running a national organization. We have grant writers. I have 17 staff across the country. I can carry the weight of many of the expectations that funders have to give us dollars. But I say that for the RESIEs at the transgender district in California that distributed, so much money directly to trans people through their COVID response. Black and Pink's COVID response platform, where we redistributed $100,000 to system impacted people all across the country, was replicated from the transgender district work. The Mariah Moores that are activating House of Tulip in the middle of the pandemic, you needed that work. And so just continue to push themselves around what does it mean to be people-centered. I think when we say like, I'm a person that I believe I'm intelligent, but also I'm a person that lives with the experience of being of ADHD. So words really matter to me. And I'm always digging in, like, what do I mean when I say that? So I know radical can be triggering to people. So my challenge for funders and systems of funding and individuals who are donating in a personal capacity is to continue to push yourself and continue to interrogate what does it mean to give, to donate, to support financially that's people-centered, right? We are part of a system of oppression. The nonprofit industrial complex, no matter how radical or transformative we want to be, that's just our truth. We work. But I believe we can interrogate what that system looks like, and we can do the work to center people at all times. I think the next piece, to go off of what LB said, not only should these folks in policy be really intentional about how we're redistributing those funds, we need to have really clear and factual conversations about how much money incarceration brings to our country. Like, really talk about it. Because I was on a call the other day and I said, so often, right, individuals will interpret what they've been compensated based on how people navigate them through a capitalist lens. As an abolitionist, my desire is to do away with capitalism. As a realist, that is my lived experience. And I think it's so ironic that we will convince and gaslight incarcerated and system impacted people that they don't have value, but on paper, we know that so many of these systems of oppression will not thrive without incarcerating people and receiving the funds that they receive for incarcerating people. And when we redistribute those funds, it should not be policymakers making that decision. Going back to my belief around giving is that my mother used to tell me, if I give someone $5 and I'm mad because they take that $5 and buy $5 of candy, then I shouldn't have given them the $5. Because I need to give, one, without expectation, and two, with the belief that the person I've vested with whatever I'm giving, I need to trust their decision. And so when we want to work with communities around reinvestment of funds, let communities decide. Let communities decide. The power of autonomy, the power of choice is transformational in itself. And you're seeing Black and Brown communities who are the most impacted, that we're doing a micro approach to redistributing these funds. Yes, a park is lovely. At a school is incredible. But these folks are saying, listen, we need mental health services. Listen, some of my kids' behavior is based on the fact that I can't afford their insulin. And so when we restrict funds, when we commodify like the way that people can distribute their need, I think that's a problem. And last but not least, we need to trust, and I say this all the time, be excited to support leadership of system impacted people, specifically LGBTQ plus people. You look at the First Step Act, you look at all of this incredible work that has happened. You tell me one trans person who you've seen released from the First Step Act. You tell me the story of one trans or queer or gender nonconforming youth that has been in the news outside of the ridiculous amount of time they've been given to go into prison. And so while we're seeing mainstream change, folks who are most oppressed within that population of system impacted people are still being behind. I'm the only Black trans woman in this country, in the entire country, running an organization the size of Black and Pink, in the entire country. And so support it, of course, financially. I would be remiss to say that, but believing in it, being excited to, you can want to be a leader all day, but if you don't have people who want to be led by you, the impact is null. And I believe excitement for someone to lead you activates and pushes that relationship in incredible ways. And I believe that will change things also.
Thank you. I don't know, LB, are you there? So I did want you to share that the criminal legal system is not just prisons. I mean, there's a whole complex, an economy, and I wanted you to touch on that. I just wanted to point out that in the last couple of days, I've learned that our 911 emergency system was built on racism, was a response to the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And there are a number of funders who are going to explore this and consider alternatives to 911. So it's just one piece of this whole continuum of how we've built structures in this country that are racist in nature. But I wanted you to just point out some of the ancillary prison-related issues that we should be aware of.
Absolutely. And sorry, my laptop was dying, so I had to get my charger, which was across my office. So all good now. I think it's really important to talk about, Dominique was talking about the capitalist society that we're living in. And you can't really disentangle mass incarceration from money, right? From this larger prison industrial complex. And you say prison industrial complex and people think immediately, private prisons, but it's so much bigger than that, right? Diane started this conversation letting us know what was happening in Connecticut and a supermax facility that's closing, some other facilities that are closing. Correctional unions themselves, right? These are public unions, are a huge special interest when we talk about decarceration, right? They're a very big hurdle, correctional unions across the country. So it's really important to understand the stake that private industry has, along with public special interest groups have in this system of mass incarceration. There's so much written about how rural towns will lure in both public prisons and private prisons because there's no future for the economy, and they're really banking on these jobs in the hotels and the restaurants that come with the prison and the visitors to jumpstart their economy. Immigration detention centers as well. There are a lot of rural areas in Texas and other states that have really lured these immigration detention centers into their town because of the job growth that it brings with them. And, one of the stats is corrections is sort of an 80 billion a year. I mean, there's lots of different numbers and statistics that people throw out in terms of how expensive corrections is. But I think really the wider, broader issue here is that we have an economy, right, that depends on this sort of prison industrial complex and probation, right? There are so many people walking around right now on probation. They have to pay probation fees to their probation officers. And you know what? Those people who might have been able to pay off their fee and be, clear and free of probation are not, simply because they haven't complied with all the conditions of their probation and their sentence and cannot get off probation because they cannot afford to pay these fees. There are, we've done a lot of work at the Brennan Center illustrating how the criminal legal system extracts wealth from communities that are poor, communities of color, communities we've never invested in, whether it's through fees and fines, whether it's through, we recently published some research indicating that even a misdemeanor conviction has significant impacts on future lost wages, felony conviction even more, and time in prison much more. And so we have to have serious conversations about this wealth extraction that our criminal legal systems are perpetuating. And, part of that conversation is really unpacking and understanding whether it's the perverse incentives that keep the system going, whether it's the private industry that has a huge financial stake in prisons, jails, probation, parole, and in some of these special interest groups like correctional unions. And so this is a conversation that's really important, and there's a lot of great work being done right now by researchers, academics, activists, formerly incarcerated people. But we've got to, if we are going to, transform and change how we view, social harms in this country, we've got to understand all of these interest groups that have a very significant stake in incarceration and the whole carceral complex.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out there are private industry that has the phone systems in prison and the transportation and the food service and all these other ancillary things that go on with that. Dominique, did you want to mention anything?
Well, I think what I'm always thinking about like the system in itself is staggering, but it's the gaslighting for me that stands out. And you see incarcerated people who these for-profit systems or these community-based businesses that are, when I was incarcerated, due to PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, I struggled to be able to get a job. My father had passed away 6 months into my 8 to 16-year prison sentence. And I fought to work for Oriental Trading Company, the little trinkets that you see shipped all over the place. And they were paying me 37 cents an hour. And I ended up going to the kitchen to work 12 hours a day for $2.25 a day so I could go into the culinary arts program. But when I was released from prison in 2009, I went to the main campus for Oriental Trading in Omaha to apply. And I was told that due to my past, due to my criminal history, I could not work there. But I could work for 37 cents an hour being a manager in their plant inside of the Omaha Correctional Center. But I could not make $11 an hour in the community. And I share that story because so many people in the community, so many folks, because I think that the language of reformists, of abolitionists, and all of these things, these are personal values. So I'm never going to approach that from a space of judgment. But I do want to make sure that, to be clear, that when you look at something and like, oh, it's great that they're getting jobs, the linkage to those opportunities are not communicated to the community. They're working for wood shops and they're making all of these masks. No one is doing the work to make sure that when this person is released, they're linked to this opportunity in the community. If systems were really intentional about the success, about the elevation of system impacted people, a link as a nonprofit agency, Diane, if I submitted an application about workforce development and there wasn't a component of how are you linking people to jobs, I'm sure you and your colleagues would say, that's a great idea, but it doesn't seem like it's fleshed out, right? Corrections is doing that every day. It's not fleshed out. What is fleshed out is that corrections is receiving money from those contracts. What is fleshed out is that when those pictures are tweeted or when people say that this system is harmful, it's used to quiet, to minimize, to try to erase the valid anger and fears that folks have about the system. But what is not happening is that you're not seeing people who can work in a system for $1.21 a day, 10 hours a day, and be happy about it and learn skills. You're not seeing the system that I believe is saying they're going to be culpable for the transformation and the restoration of system impacted people. You're not seeing that linkage happen. And because of that, you have organizations like Critical Resistance, A New Way of Life, where we're trying to do that as an intercessor. So when you think about these opportunities, understand that these systems don't create opportunities that center the incarcerated people. And so we need to invest and support organizations that are squarely doing that, even if we're not understanding how it's going to happen. I think that goes back to the trust leadership piece, because the system doesn't know how it's going to happen, and we fund and we support that every day. So let us not use that as a reason to erase, to minimize the power of system impacted leadership.
Thank you. I know that we're running out of time. We've probably passed the time that we would go into Q&A, but I do want to ask you both. We have people in the audience who maybe are not the choir yet. And so there are components of society that need to be convinced that we have to change minds and hearts. So I know that the Brennan Center is working with law enforcement leaders who are looking more progressively at system reform. There are more faith leaders getting involved. There are physicians groups getting involved. I'm wondering if each of you could just touch upon who needs to be convinced, who needs to be pushed forward as a reformer, somebody who wants to force change of this system. LB, do you want to mention the law enforcement group and any other population?
Sure. And what Diane's referring to is a group that the Brennan Center helps coordinate called Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. And this is a group of law enforcement, correctional officials, police officials, some prosecutors, who push for criminal legal change, who push for the end of mass incarceration, And the group has been important because there are some policymakers who do need to hear from law enforcement, who many of them are the first ones to say, policing as we know it is not working. We don't want to respond to all of these 911 calls. We are pushing for co-responder models. We're pushing for social workers to respond to some of these 911 calls. But I would say, broader than that, the broader public needs to understand the devastating consequences of mass incarceration on its impact on communities. There are still, Dominique was talking about the other, right? And there are so many people in this country who have no experience with incarceration, which is, I think, why you saw those tweets, right? At the beginning of the pandemic. There's just no real understanding of what it is like to spend any time in a jail or a prison or be on probation. We've done a lot of work with prosecutors' offices and trying to get them to change their culture and their decision-making, taking prosecutors, believe it or not, many prosecutors in this country who are advocating to sentence people to prison have never been to prison. How have we built a system where felony prosecutors are asking judges to send defendants to prison and they have no idea what happens there? So the work we have to do is so tremendous, and it comes, there's really no end, right? We have to work with policymakers. We have to work with local prosecutors. We have to support public defenders who are just tremendously under-resourced in this country. And I would say the broader public needs to understand what these places are like and how devastating our experiment with mass incarceration that we have proven time and time again with research and writing has not worked. We've got to keep working at sort of all levels with advocates, with academics, with researchers, until we really do start to see transformational change.
Sorry, Diane. LB, I completely agree. One thing that I've focused on, again, Black and Pink is an abolitionist organization, but also we're working to center the needs and to shift this experience. And for me, it's if I feel like I'm not really doing my work, because initially we were not focusing on the experiences of youth who were system impacted. And we really haven't talked about that a lot. We've talked about the carceral state as a whole, but the school to prison line is not just some out there. It's very much true that long before I stepped place in the adult system, I was being trained in the juvenile system through diversion, through group homes, through being told all of these things about myself. And looking back at 39, much of my barriers were about I was navigating my gender and no one had ever used the word gender in front of me, right? And so we need to do work that is also, I think, the way to do work to dismantle the system in a proactive way is centering young folks and addressing the youth systems. And Diane specifically said the folks who aren't in the choir. What I hope to be the case is that no matter what you feel about adults, if I can't get you to open your mind or expand about the circumstances and the impact of incarceration for adults, I hope that I can get you to look at the impact of young people and understand that these kids are being thrown into these systems because the way that adults were locked in these prisons during COVID-19, these kids were in juvenile detention centers. The way that that the adults weren't given access to court, you had kids in detention centers that were not going to court, the court that was going to make sure they would go home for Christmas or see their family. I got all these calls from moms who said I was going to have my baby home, but due to COVID, we can't even get to court and the juvenile jail won't release them and send them home. Or they're going to send them home, but can Black and Pink pay for our phone to get turned back on because they have to have an ankle monitor? So Black and Pink is launching an initiative called Opportunity Campus in Omaha, Nebraska. It will serve the entire country, looking at the needs of LGBTQ plus youth. I don't believe in a large initiative around youth system abolition centered in youth has really happened. And so we want to make that happen, from housing to launching a school and really activating that experience. So I want to say, if you can't look at adults and because grace quotient is important. And I'm saying, because I also want to say that I'm not saying if you can't as in a judgment, you can't as in I was a formerly incarcerated person that 6-7 years ago was very much in belief that some people were good people and some people were bad people. So my values are an evolution. They continue to be an evolution. So as long as you're challenging and interrogating yourself, I believe it's okay. But I hope and believe that your grace quotient and your desire for young people to thrive, for young people to be safe, is in a space where you can engage with us around system dismantlement. And if you're doing that, I can promise you're going to see the connection to the adult system. And so if you want children to be safe, you have to undo the adult system, and vice versa. And that's how I hope we can connect with some of the folks who aren't in the choir. And I hope you sit next to me in the baritone section, because that section is always pretty sparse. So we can harmonize together as we.
I am so sorry that we only have a few minutes left, but I don't want to lose a couple of points that I did want to make as a funder. I think it's really important to address narrative change. We have to change the language we use when we talk about people who are involved in the justice system. We should not be calling people inmates, convicts, felons, so forth. We just have to change the way we humanize, we talk about people and humanize them. We have found it effective to support nonprofit journalism to make sure our issues are being covered and that the public is, we build awareness with the public. We are supporting organizers, and we feel like the well-being of organizers, the capacity building of their initiatives are super important. And advocacy, of course, because we need to change both the front end of the system, the bail system, all of that, the conditions in prison, the reentry needs of the population, and remove these collateral consequences and barriers that keep people suppressed. There is a question in the chat about Black women who suffer from domestic violence and how we can help them and their violent partners. I know, and I'll just say it quickly, that in New York, Domestic Violence Survivors Act was signed into law by Governor Cuomo a couple of years ago, and there are efforts to identify and engage people, especially women in prison, whose offense may have been caused by their domestic violence experience, and many of them hopefully will be represented by qualified attorneys in order to get a rehearing of their case and hopefully release from prison. And I think that's something that every state should consider. And so I don't know if either of you want to discuss domestic violence and the treatment of people who are exposed to that. And
yes, I will say one of my biggest barriers to completely sit abolitionist value and experience was the fact that I not only experienced harm in relationships physically and sexually, I experienced sexual harm in the system from correctional officers. And I was trying to, it was a huge barrier for me to divest from the idea that I would receive transformation and I would receive healing from those folks being incarcerated or those folks experiencing the same harm I experienced. And two, I have to work in a way and I have to live in a way that believes that everybody has a possibility to become their best selves, right? And that was difficult. I think that centering the needs of those who are impacted by the harm are abolitionist values. So what the policy that Diane spoke about, and you're seeing that work a lot across the country, is awesome. But we also need to make sure that we are investing in transformational work for every person who's involved in that system of harm. Because the data shows that when folks are incarcerated, folks who are found guilty of domestic violence charges and so on and so forth, they're not given large sentences. They're given probation. They're given a few months in jail. And I say that because they're coming back to the community and they may not be able to harm that person that they engaged in that interaction again, but they're going to live out here again. And so somewhere there's a possibility for the harm to happen. And so if we're not leaning into those who cause harm in a way with grace and a desire for them to be better. I don't see this experience of violence, domestic violence, interpartner violence, which is very prolific in LGBTQ plus relationships, especially LGBTQ plus teens. We're not going to see that shift. We can't leave any part out when we think about what does transformation look like, how can we address it? Black women explicitly, I think on top of that approach, we need to challenge and engage white women around what does solidarity look like for the needs of Black women. And deficit, not just white women talking to us about eugenics and Planned Parenthood, which is work as a sexual health educator, I think is powerful. But I'm talking about the foundational understanding as much as white men and when I say men on the spectrum of manhood, whether it's presenting or masculine presenting and all those other things are accountable for white supremacy, the folks who made those plates, the folks who washed their clothes after they went out and caused harm were white women. And so how are white women who are in a space of power and access, which is inherent just because they're white women, positioning themselves to engage in solidarity, healing, and transformative work for Black women? And again, Black women on the spectrum, trans Black women, cisgender Black women, Black femmes in our society. And I think that is a way to address immediate harm while we work and see and hope that the cultural impact shifts long-term.
So it looks like we're at time, and I know there are probably other questions. So we did put our email if people want to reach out to us. And also there's the link to continue the conversation. But I do want to thank our speakers, Eisen, Dominique Morgan, thank you so much, and the student organizers at the Yale Philanthropy Conference. I suggested a few books there for people who want to read more about these issues. I would encourage those who are out there, over 500 people, to join coalitions to learn more about the justice system and what you can do in your local community or in your funding area and support